Love doesn't ask what's in your bank account. But betrayal always finds out. The knock came at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the wedding, while I was still rinsing coffee out of 2 mugs instead of 1. Through the peephole I saw a young man in a gray suit that fit too well for a casual visit, and beside him, a woman holding a leather folio thick enough to be a small book. My husband was in the shower. I opened the door anyway. Because I already knew who this was before he said a word. Get comfortable, this story is going to take you somewhere. Hit that like button and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. My name is Renata Cole, I'm 51 years old, and until 3 years ago I ran a logistics company out of Charlotte, North Carolina, that I built from a single leased warehouse into a fleet of 200 trucks. I sold it in the spring of 2023 for $43 million after taxes, wired into an account nobody but my accountant and my late husband's estate attorney knew existed. I have one daughter, Priya, 26, who works in nonprofit housing in Raleigh and drives a Honda with 200,000 miles on it because she refuses to let me buy her a new one. I raised her alone after my first husband, Marcus, died of a heart attack in a hotel gym in Dallas when she was 11. I know what it is to build something out of nothing, and I know what it is to watch people circle you once they find out you have something worth taking. Which is exactly why, when I met Walt Dorr at a pottery class in a community center off Providence Road, I didn't tell him what I was worth. Walt was 62, a retired high school shop teacher, the kind of man who still fixed his own gutters and drove a 14-year-old Ford Ranger with a dent in the tailgate he never bothered to fix. His hands were rough from 40 years of woodworking. He made me a walnut jewelry box before we'd even had our first real date, just because he noticed I kept my earrings in a sandwich bag. I fell for him slowly, the way you fall for someone in your 50s, not in a rush of fireworks, but in a long, steady warmth, like a fire you keep feeding one log at a time. We dated for 14 months. I told him I'd sold business, never the number. I told him I was comfortable, never that I was rich. I wanted him to love the woman who laughed too loud at his terrible puns, who brought him soup when his knee flared up, who sat next to him on his porch swinging Matthews and watched the fireflies. Not a bank balance. I'd learned that lesson already, watching what money did to people who found out about it too soon. So I kept it locked away, the way you'd keep a scar covered, not out of shame, but because it wasn't the first thing I wanted anyone to see. Walt had a son, Bryce, 33, a mortgage broker in Fort Mill, who called his father, maybe once a month and visited twice a year, usually around the holidays, usually needing something. Walt loved him anyway, the uncomplicated way fathers love their sons, even when the sons don't quite earn it. Bryce came to exactly one dinner with me before the wedding. He shook my hand, told me it was great that his dad had found someone, and spent most of the meal on his phone. I remember thinking he had his father's jaw and none of his father's warmth. We got married on a Saturday in June, in Walt's backyard, under a pergola he'd built himself out of cedar 2 summers earlier. Priya walked me down the aisle. 40 guests, a barbecue caterer, a 3-tier lemon cake because Walt didn't like chocolate. It was small and unpretentious and exactly what I wanted. Walt cried during his vows. I did too. Bryce showed up 40 minutes late in a rental car and left before the cake was cut. 3 days later, he was standing on our porch with a lawyer. I want to be honest about what I felt in that doorway, because it wasn't fear. It was something closer to recognition. The particular, exhausted clarity of watching a pattern repeat itself. I'd seen this movie before, just with different actors. So before Bryce could get a single word out, before the lawyer could open that leather folio, I asked him the only question that mattered. Did your father send you? Bryce blinked, thrown off his script. What? No. This isn't about him. This is about protecting my dad's assets from. He stopped himself, glanced at the lawyer, then back at me, and finished the sentence anyway. From a woman who married him 3 days ago and clearly wants a piece of something she didn't build. Behind me I heard the shower shut off. I don't need a piece of your father's house, Bryce, I said. I could buy this entire street. He laughed, short and sharp. The laugh of someone who has already decided you're lying. Right, sure you could. The lawyer, a woman named Carol Fenn from a firm in Rock Hill, cleared her throat and extended a hand I didn't take. Mrs. Dorr, we're here to discuss a postnuptial agreement. Given the circumstances of the marriage's timeline, my client felt it was prudent to formalize. Given what circumstances? I said. Bryce's jaw tightened, and that's when he said it. Cutting, casual, the kind of insult that's engineered to sound like concern. The circumstances where a woman with no visible income marries a retired shop teacher 2 months after they get serious, and now stands to inherit a paid-off house and his pension. I looked you up, Renata. There's nothing. No job, no assets, nothing on paper. You're a ghost, and ghosts don't marry broke old men for love. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't correct him. I just said, is that what you think happened here? It wasn't a question. He took it as an insult anyway, which told me everything about how he saw me. A woman to be managed, not answered. I felt the old familiar tightening in my chest. The one I used to feel in boardrooms full of men who assumed the woman at the head of the table was somebody's assistant. I didn't explode. I've never once solved a problem by exploding. I closed the door most of the way, told him Walt and I would be in touch through our own lawyer, and watched Bryce's expensive lawyer look mildly embarrassed on his behalf as they walked back to their car. I wasn't angry that he thought I had nothing. I was angry, and I'll admit it now, from a safe distance, at the assumption underneath it, that a woman without a husband's name on her assets must be empty-handed. That the only reason a woman like me would marry a man like Walt is scarcity, not love. I decided, standing in that doorway, that Bryce Dorr was going to learn exactly how wrong he was, but not yet, and not by me simply telling him. Some lessons only stick if a man watches himself walk right into them. If you've been listening for a while, do us a quick favor. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Walt came downstairs in a t-shirt, toweling his hair, and asked who'd been at the door. I told him it was a delivery for the neighbors. I wasn't ready yet to bring him into it. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I needed to know, cleanly and completely, whether his son was acting alone, or whether there was a conversation I hadn't been part of. That afternoon I called my accountant, a sharp, unflappable man named Desmond Akib, who'd handled my finances since the sale of the company. I asked him to quietly confirm 2 things. Whether Bryce Dorr had made any inquiries with our mutual bank, and whether there'd been any contact between Bryce and Walt's estate attorney in the past month. Desmond called back 2 days later. There had been an inquiry, a call from a woman identifying herself as Bryce's fiancé's cousin, just asking general questions about postnup timelines at a bank where, coincidentally, I happened to be a private client. The teller had said nothing, per policy, but the call itself told me Bryce had been circling for longer than 3 days. I also called Priya, because if anyone in my life could smell a con from a mile off, it was my daughter. She listened, quiet and sharp the way she gets when something makes her protective, and then she said, "Mom, you need Marissa." Marissa O'Caffer was a family law attorney Priya had worked with on a tenants' rights case, based out of Charlotte, known for being precise, patient, and utterly without mercy in a negotiation. I met with Marissa on a Thursday afternoon in her office on South Tryon Street, 17 floors up, city spread out gray and glinting below us. "Here's what we're not going to do," Marissa said, sliding a legal pad across the desk. "We're not going to react defensively. Defensive people look guilty. We're going to let him keep believing exactly what he already believes about you, right up until the moment it stops being useful to him." Over the next 2 weeks, Marissa and I built a file. Bank statements. The sale agreement for the logistics company, still under a non-disclosure clause that had quietly expired the month before the wedding. Documentation of the trust I'd already set up, before I even met Walt, that named Priya as primary beneficiary and included a modest, separate provision for a future spouse, drafted 8 months before Bryce ever showed up with a lawyer. Every piece of paper Bryce assumed didn't exist, because he'd Googled my name and found nothing. Not understanding that people who actually have $43 million are usually the last ones you'll find bragging about it online. I also had a long talk with Walt. I told him everything. The sale, the number, the reason I'd kept it quiet. He sat very still at our kitchen table, turning his coffee mug slowly in his hands, and when I finished he said only, "I wish you'd told me sooner, not because of the money, but because you were carrying that alone." That was the moment I knew, fully and finally, that I hadn't married the wrong kind of man. He asked one more question. Whether Bryce knew yet. And when I told him no, he nodded slowly and said, "Then let's decide together how he finds out." We decided on Sunday dinner. Walt's sister Carol Ann was hosting her annual 4th of July cookout that year in Weddington. The kind of gathering where the whole extended family showed up. Cousins, in-laws, Walt's old teaching colleagues, Bryce and his fiancée Dana. I asked Walt to invite Marissa as a friend from my old company, and I asked Desmond to come along too, introduced simply as an old business associate. Nobody but Walt and I knew what was coming. Bryce arrived in a pressed polo shirt, confident, relaxed, clearly having decided the postnup conversation was a formality, now delayed rather than dead. Dinner went the way family dinners go. Potato salad. Too much sun, somebody's dog getting into the corn. It was near the end, over pie, when Bryce leaned back in his lawn chair and said, loud enough for the table, "So, Renata, find a job yet, or is retirement treating you okay?" It landed exactly how he wanted it to. A few people chuckled, uncomfortable. Walt didn't laugh. I set my fork down on the edge of my plate, deliberately, and let the small clink of it settle over the table before I spoke. "Funny you should ask, Bryce. Because 3 days after my wedding, you showed up at my door with a lawyer, accusing me of marrying your father for a house and a pension." A few heads turned. Dana went very still. "You said, and I'm quoting you exactly, that ghosts don't marry broke old men for love. So I want to answer that properly, in front of everyone, since you clearly needed an audience the first time too." I nodded to Marissa, who slid a folder across the picnic table. The sale agreement, the closing statement, the wire confirmation. I nodded to Desmond, who confirmed, plainly and without theater, that he'd managed my accounts personally since 2023. Carol Ann's hand went to her mouth. Walt's old teaching colleague let out a low whistle. He immediately tried to swallow. "I sold my company for $43 million 2 years before I ever met your father," I said. "I didn't tell him, because I wanted him to love me, not the number. I didn't tell you, Bryce, because frankly, it was none of your business, until you made it your business by showing up at my house with a lawyer, calling my bank, and telling me to my face I was after your father's pension." Bryce's face had gone the color of the paper plate in front of him. Dana had already scooted her chair an inch away from his, which told its own story. He opened his mouth twice and closed it, no version of a comeback landing in time. Walt stood up then, slow and deliberate. The way he used to stand at the front of a shop classroom to get everyone's attention without raising his voice. He didn't look angry so much as tired. The particular tiredness of a father who has just watched his son prove a stranger's worst assumption right. "You didn't come to protect me, Bryce," Walt said quietly. "You came because you did the math on what you thought you were owed. And you were so busy doing that math, you never once asked your father if he was happy." He let that sit. "I am. For the first time in 6 years I am. And you almost blew it up over a number you got wrong." Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Carol Ann, of all people, started clearing pie plates like it was any other Sunday, which is its own kind of Southern mercy. Giving a man room to leave with whatever dignity was left. Bryce and Dana left 20 minutes later. He didn't apologize that day. Grand gestures never come easy to men who've built their whole identity on being the smart one in the room. But 3 weeks after, Walt told me Bryce had called him, not me, him, and asked, quietly, if he could come by alone sometime. He came by on a Tuesday evening in August, sat at our kitchen table where his father had once turned a coffee mug in his hands, and said he was sorry. That he'd let a bank teller's rumor and his own assumptions do more talking than his father ever had a chance to. I didn't need the apology for myself. I needed it for Walt, who deserved a son who saw him clearly, and slowly, over that fall, he started to get one. I set up a small education fund that November for Bryce and Dana's first child, due the following spring, not as an olive branch exactly, but as a quiet correction, proof that generosity was never the thing I'd been withholding. Trust was. People will always tell you what they think you have, long before they bother to ask what you actually built. I didn't marry Walt to hide from that. I married him because, for once, somebody looked at me and never once asked. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from. I'll see you on the next one.